Imagine being summoned to a palace, not to be celebrated, but to be the punchline of a cruel joke shared by the world's most powerful people. This was the fate Evelyn Rowland intended for Amara Johnson. Amara was a caregiver, a shadow that moved silently through the marble halls of the Rowland mansion. For years, she had changed linens and administered medicine while billionaires discussed high-stakes betrayals as if she were merely part of the furniture. Most looked right through her. To them, she was an invisible servant with no voice. So, when the gold-embossed invitation to the Rowlands' grand gala arrived, it felt like a strange, impossible dream. But Amara knew better. This invitation carried poison. It wasn't a seat at the table. It was a trap designed to humiliate her. Yet, life has a way of flipping the script. On the night of the gala, the woman they expected to mock, the one they planned to laugh at, stepped into the ballroom like a queen, and the silence that followed was deafening. What happened next? Nobody in that room could have predicted it. Before we dive into this incredible reveal, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Inside the Rowland estate, the air tasted like old money and arrogance. Every surface was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the cold glitter of crystal chandeliers and the pride of guests who showed off their wealth like armor. Executives in tailored suits moved with a frantic energy, making deals that shifted markets, while everyone looked like they belonged, except Amara. Usually, she was seen only with her head down, her hands showing the story of a lifetime of sacrifice and quiet strength. She knew every corner of that house, every hidden stain, and every secret whispered behind closed doors. Because Amara knew the greatest secret of all, when people decide you are invisible, they stop lying. They let you hear everything. Amara Johnson moved through the Rowland mansion with the practiced silence of a shadow, a ghost in a world made of cold marble and unforgiving glass. To the powerful men who paced the hallways barking orders into gold-plated phones, she was less than a person. She was merely part of the furniture, a stationary fixture meant to keep their lives polished and seamless. Her hands, etched with the fine lines of 1,000 sacrifices, worked with a rhythm that required no thought, wiping away the fingerprints of people who had never bothered to learn her name. This was the marble world of Victor and Evelyn Rowland, a place where wealth wasn't just possessed, it was used as armor to deflect the reality of those beneath them. As a caregiver, Amara's presence was a necessity they preferred to forget. She occupied the quiet corners, the sick rooms, and the service corridors, moving with a straight-backed dignity that none of the elite ever noticed because they never looked high enough to see her face. She knew the exact temperature Victor liked his morning tea and the precise scent of the expensive cedarwood candles Evelyn insisted upon. Details of lives she guarded while her own remained a mystery to them. But there was a hidden power in being a ghost. In this sprawling estate, silence was Amara's greatest tool. While Evelyn Rowland stood in the grand foyer, her voice sharp with arrogance as she discussed the poison she intended for her enemies, she never paused to consider that the woman dusting the nearby vase was listening. The elite talked freely in front of Amara because they truly believed she didn't exist beyond her function. They treated her as if she were deaf and blind, failing to realize that when people decide you are invisible, they stop lying. Amara saw the mirrored shine of their public lives and the dark, jagged stains of their private secrets. She felt the weight of the billion-dollar betrayals whispered in the library and the coldness of a marriage held together only by high-stakes contracts. Every day, she absorbed the rot beneath the Rowland empire, filing it away behind a calm, composed expression. To the world, she was just a black caregiver with tired eyes and worn gloves, a humble servant in a house of giants. But inside, Amara was the most informed person in the mansion, a silent ledger of every lie told in the dark. She was the shadow that knew the truth of the light, waiting for the moment when the furniture would finally speak back. The afternoon sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the sunroom, casting long, sharp shadows across the white marble. Evelyn Rowland sat perched on a velvet chaise lounge, the gold-embossed edges of a stack of invitations glinting in her hand like a weapon. Amara was there, as she always was, silently adjusting the pillows and ensuring the chilled water was within reach, moving with the quiet grace of a woman who had learned to occupy the smallest amount of space possible. Evelyn didn't look up as Amara approached. She simply held out a single, heavy envelope, her manicured nails clicking against the thick cardstock. "Amara," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that felt like a serrated edge. "I've decided that you've worked far too hard for this family to be left out of our anniversary gala. Consider this a gift." Amara took the invitation, her fingers feeling the weight of the poison Evelyn had hidden inside the gilded trap. She didn't need to open it to know what was happening. She had heard the whispers in the powder room earlier that morning, the sharp, high-pitched laughter of Evelyn's friends as they discussed the entertainment for the evening. They wanted a homely caregiver to parade in front of the cameras, a drab contrast to their own surgically enhanced perfection. It was a public mockery disguised as a gesture of kindness, a way to remind Amara and everyone else exactly where she stood on the social ladder. As Amara withdrew back into the shadows of the hallway, the sound of feminine giggles erupted behind her. Evelyn's elite circle had begun their cruel work. Can you imagine the look on her face when she walks into a room full of diamonds wearing that? "Whatever it is she wears," one woman sneered, her voice carrying easily through the open door. "It's charity, really," another added, giving her a night to see how the other half lives before she goes back to scrubbing the toilets. They spoke as if Amara were deaf, as if the walls of the mansion didn't have ears. Evelyn smiled, a cold, triumphant expression that didn't reach her eyes, confident that her joke would be the highlight of the season. She expected Amara to arrive small, ashamed, and out of place. What Evelyn failed to realize was that Amara wasn't just holding a card. She was holding the key to a door the Rowlands had spent a lifetime trying to keep locked. The trap was set, but as Amara looked down at the gold lettering, her back stayed straight. The invisible observer was finally ready to be seen. In the solitude of her modest quarters, Amara sat with the heavy, gold-embossed invitation resting on her lap, but her mind was elsewhere, wandering through the quiet corners of the Rowland mansion. For years, she had been a silent ledger, recording the secrets that the elite carelessly spilled in her presence, believing her to be as inanimate as the walls. She remembered the cold Tuesday evening she spent polishing the silver in the library while Victor Rowland, his voice hushed but urgent, discussed a billion-dollar betrayal that involved offshore accounts and a merger built on a foundation of lies. He hadn't even paused when she entered to refresh his tea. To him, she was merely a shadow that didn't possess the capacity to understand the business crimes he was orchestrating. Her memory shifted to the personal deceits that poisoned the air of the estate. She recalled the sharp, hushed arguments in the master suite where Evelyn Rowland spoke of poison intended for her rivals, her words revealing a cruelty that went far deeper than her public persona. Amara had overheard the frantic phone calls about cover-ups and the jagged stains of personal lies that threatened to dismantle the Rowlands' carefully constructed image of perfection. She knew about the secrets in the scum, the moral rot that the family tried to scrub away with their immense wealth, failing to realize that the woman who cleaned their floors had seen every drop of it. As she traced the elegant calligraphy on the card, Amara realized that her ledger was full. She wasn't just a caregiver. She was the guardian of the Rowlands' most dangerous truths. The invisible woman had gathered the very weapons that would turn Evelyn's mockery into a nightmare. Every whispered confession she had caught while they thought she wasn't listening was now a thread in the royal tapestry she was preparing to wear. They had invited her to be a joke, a homely distraction for their amusement. But they had forgotten that when you treat someone like furniture, you forget they have ears. Amara closed her eyes, the weight of the ledger finally feeling like power rather than a burden. The night of the gala wouldn't just be about a dress. It would be the moment the shadow finally brought the secrets of the dark into the blinding light of the ballroom. The days leading up to the gala felt like the calm before a storm, a quiet sharpening of blades. In the Rowland mansion, Evelyn was busy supervising the delivery of floral arrangements that cost more than Amara made in a year, her laughter echoing through the halls as she anticipated the joke that was to come. But in a small, dimly lit room on the other side of town, Amara Johnson was preparing for a different kind of theater. She stood before a cracked mirror, the familiar, starchy fabric of her caregiver uniform pulled at her feet like a shed skin. For 20 years, that drab gray polyester had been her camouflage, a signal to the world that she was a servant, a helper, a nobody. Today, she stepped out of the shadow. From a garment bag hidden in the back of her closet, she withdrew the weapon she had chosen for this war, a gown of vibrant, deep sapphire blue. As the heavy silk slid over her shoulders, the transformation was instantaneous. The off-the-shoulder neckline revealed a collarbone held high with years of restrained strength, and the intricate silver embroidery at the cuffs shimmered like armor. This wasn't just a dress, it was a declaration. The sapphire hue was a royal defiance, a color that didn't ask for permission to be seen, it demanded it. Amara spent hours on the small details that the elite usually ignored. She polished her skin until it glowed with the health they tried to buy with expensive serums. She styled her hair into a crown that added inches to her height, emphasizing a regal posture that had always been there, suppressed under the weight of her duties. She didn't look like a woman preparing for a party. She looked like a general preparing for a status reversal. As she fastened a simple but elegant silver clasp around her neck, she felt the weight of the ledger she carried in her mind, the secrets, the crimes, and the lies of the Rowland family. She was no longer the woman who cleaned the scum from their marble. She was the woman who knew exactly how that marble had been paid for. Looking at her reflection, the invisible caregiver was gone. In her place stood a woman of calm, composed control, a queen who was about to walk into a trap and turn it into her throne. Amara took a deep breath, the silk rustling with the sound of a new destiny, and stepped out into the night. The Rowland ballroom was a cathedral of vanity, draped in silk and bathed in the artificial glow of 1,000 crystal prisms. Every surface was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the faces of the stunned elite who moved through the space with the practiced ease of predators in their natural habitat. Here, money didn't just talk, it screamed. Men in $10,000 tuxedos clinked glasses of vintage champagne, discussing mergers and acquisitions as if they were playing a game of chess with the lives of others, while women adorned in diamonds worth more than a caregiver's lifetime earnings exchanged whispers that carried the sting of a viper's strike. At the center of it all was Evelyn Rowland. She stood near the grand entrance, her eyes darting toward the clock with a predatory gleam. She was the architect of this evening's cruelest entertainment, and she had already primed her guests for the joke. Between sips of bubbly, she had dropped careful hints to the press and her inner circle about a very special guest who would be joining them. A humble servant she was mentoring out of the goodness of her heart. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the palpable anticipation of a crowd waiting for someone to fail. They were hungry for the sight of a chubby caregiver stumbling across the marble, looking small, ashamed, and desperately out of place in her Sunday best. She should be here any minute, Evelyn whispered to a friend, her lips curling into a smile that was as cold as the ice in her glass. I told her the dress code was formal, but I'm sure her idea of formal involves polyester and sensible shoes. The group erupted into hushed, jagged laughter, their eyes fixed on the door. They had gathered to witness a humiliation, a public reminder that no matter how close a servant stood to the throne, they could never sit upon it. The musicians played a light, airy waltz, but the music felt like a funeral march for the dignity they expected Amara to lose. The stunned elite didn't realize that they were the ones being observed. They didn't see that their arrogance had blinded them to the reality of the woman they were waiting for. They were so focused on the punchline that they failed to see the shifting of the tectonic plates beneath their feet. The gala was a monument to their own importance, a house of cards built on the belief that the invisible would always stay in the dark. But as the double doors at the far end of the hall began to groan open, the atmosphere in the room changed. The air grew heavy, the whispers died in throats, and the gala of arrogance was suddenly violently interrupted by a presence that none of them, especially not Evelyn, was prepared for. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open with a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very soles of the guests' feet. For a heartbeat, the room continued its shallow hum, Evelyn Rowland's head tilting back in anticipation of the ridicule she had so carefully prepared. But then, the music didn't just fade, it died. The lead violinist's bow stalled mid-stroke, and a silence so absolute it felt heavy descended upon the gala of arrogance. Amara Johnson did not walk into the room, she occupied it. She stood at the threshold, the vibrant sapphire of her gown catching the light of the crystal chandeliers and throwing back a radiance that made the diamonds of the elite look like dull glass. The silver embroidery at her cuffs and neckline shimmered like moonlight on a deep ocean, framing a face that was a masterpiece of calm, composed control. There was no trace of the homely caregiver they had been promised. There were no sensible shoes or polyester seams. Instead, Amara stood with a regal posture that seemed to elongate her entire frame, her chin tilted at an angle that spoke not of defiance, but of an inherent, unshakable sovereignty. The stunned elite stood frozen, glasses of champagne suspended halfway to their lips. Evelyn's triumphant smile curdled into a mask of pure disbelief, her jaw dropping as she looked at the woman she had intended to humiliate. She searched for a crack in Amara's armor, a sign of the servant she had bullied, but she found only the commanding presence of a queen who had finally claimed her throne. Amara's eyes, once downcast and invisible, swept across the room with a terrifying clarity. She didn't look like a guest. She looked like the owner of every secret hidden beneath the floorboards. The status reversal was absolute. In that single, frozen frame of time, the hierarchy of the Rowland Empire crumbled. The woman who had been treated as building furniture was now the only living thing in the room, her silence more powerful than any speech. She began her descent down the grand staircase, the silk of her gown rustling with a sound like a coming storm. With every step, the peripheral panic of the bullies grew, their whispers replaced by a breathless awe. Amara Johnson had arrived, and as she reached the center of the marble floor, the world realized that the joke was over, and the reckoning had just begun. Victor Rowland stood paralyzed as the sapphire-clad woman crossed the ballroom floor, her presence cutting through the crowd like a blade. He had been prepared to laugh, to play along with Evelyn's petty game of social execution, but as Amara drew closer, the air seemed to vanish from his lungs. The room, filled with this stunned elite, became a blur of irrelevant faces. All Victor could see was the woman he had spent 20 years trying to forget, the woman who had been the architect of his survival long before he was a billionaire. His eyes drifted down to her hand, which rested with a calm, dominant grace at her side. There, glinting under the harsh light of the crystal chandeliers, was a ring. It wasn't a diamond from a high-end boutique, but a vintage gold band with a distinct, interlaced pattern, a piece of jewelry Victor hadn't seen since the darkest days of his youth. It was the forgotten debt made flesh. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His hands rose in a frozen, defensive gesture as if trying to ward off a ghost. 20 years ago, before the private jets and the marble towers, Victor had been a man on the brink of total ruin, a desperate soul whose empire would have collapsed before it even began if not for a stranger's sacrifice. Amara hadn't just been his caregiver. She had been the silent guardian who had pawned her own future to save his. He had promised to find her, to repay her, to honor her. But as his wealth grew, so did his shame, until he had convinced himself that she was just another, invisible servant he could bury under the weight of his success. Amara, he finally managed to whisper, his voice cracking, loud enough only for those in the immediate circle to hear. The exaggerated shock on his face was a map of his own guilt. Beside him, Evelyn's expression shifted from confusion to a cold, creeping fear. She looked at the ring, then at her husband's trembling hands, and finally at the regal woman standing before them. The humiliation trap hadn't just backfired, it had detonated. Victor Rowland, the man who bowed to no one, was visibly crumbling in the presence of the woman he had treated like furniture. Amara didn't flinch. She met his gaze with an emotional ownership that was terrifying in its stillness. She didn't need to say a word. The ring spoke for her, reminding him of the man he used to be and the debt that had finally come due. The billionaire realized, with a sickening jolt, that the caregiver wasn't here for a gala. She was here for the reckoning. Evelyn Rowland felt the social ground shifting beneath her designer heels, and like a cornered predator, she lunged. The silence in the ballroom was suffocating, a vacuum that Amara had created simply by existing, and Evelyn could not allow it to continue. She forced a high, brittle laugh that echoed unnaturally against the marble walls, stepping forward with her bouquet of white roses held like a shield. "Well, Amara," Evelyn began, her voice projected for the benefit of the surrounding guests, though her eyes were wide with a frantic, creeping fear. "I must say, you've certainly outdone yourself. It's amazing what a bit of theater and a rented costume can do for a servant's confidence. Tell us, dear, did you take a loan against your meager wages to play dress-up for a night? Or did you think that putting on a gown would make us forget whose floors you were scrubbing just yesterday?" The guests stirred, a few hesitant titters rippling through the crowd as they looked for a cue to return to their mockery. They expected Amara to wither, to stammer, to be reminded of her place. But the humiliation trap hit a wall of absolute stillness. Amara didn't flinch. She didn't even look at Evelyn's face. Instead, she let her gaze fall slowly, almost pityingly, to the champagne glass trembling in Evelyn's hand. With quiet control, Amara stepped into Evelyn's personal space, her regal posture making the billionaire's wife seem suddenly small and frantic. "Evelyn," Amara said, her voice low and resonant, carrying a weight that silenced the room more effectively than a shout. "You talk of theater, yet you are the one wearing a mask that is slipping. You invited me here to provide a laugh for your friends, to satisfy a soul that is as empty as the glasses you keep filling. But while you were busy planning this joke, you forgot that I was the one who saw you when the cameras were off. I know the truth behind the poison you discussed in the sunroom. I know about the offshore accounts you've hidden from Victor. And I know that the only reason you are standing so tall tonight is because you are balanced on a foundation of lies that I have already begun to dismantle." The color drained from Evelyn's face, leaving her a ghastly shade of gray. The backfire was absolute. Amara's words were precise, surgical strikes, delivered with an emotional ownership that left Evelyn exposed and defenseless. The bully who had intended to mock was now the one being publicly dismantled. Amara leaned in closer, her eyes cold and unwavering. "You thought you were bringing a servant to a party, Evelyn. You didn't realize you were inviting the one person who has the power to take everything you have." Evelyn's bouquet hit the floor, petals scattering like the ruins of her reputation. The crowd watched in awe and shock as the social hierarchy flipped. The caregiver wasn't just standing in the room. She was the only one in it who was truly free. The silence in the ballroom had grown heavy, no longer just a lack of sound, but a physical pressure that seemed to squeeze the air from the lungs of the elite. Victor Rowland stood frozen, his eyes locked on the vintage ring Amara wore, while Evelyn trembled beside him, her social mask shattered beyond repair. Amara did not rush the moment. She allowed the weight of their billion-dollar betrayal to hang in the air, a phantom presence more real than the crystal chandeliers overhead. "You spent so much time making sure I was invisible, Victor," Amara said, her voice a calm, melodic contrast to the rising panic in the room. "You and your partners sat in that library discussing the merger with the Holloway Group as if I were merely a shadow on the wall. You thought the woman pouring your scotch couldn't understand the numbers or the names, or the fact that the entire deal is built on a fabricated valuation of your European assets." A collective gasp rippled through the guests. This wasn't just a personal grievance. This was a hand on the throat of the Rowland Empire. Victor's face turned a ghostly shade of white as the high-ranking investors in the crowd began to whisper, their eyes darting toward him with newfound suspicion. Amara stepped closer, her sapphire gown shimmering with every steady breath. I have seen the original ledgers you thought were shredded, tucked away in the very corners you told me were too dusty for your concern. I know that the $2 billion the Halloways are about to sign over is being funneled into a shell company that Evelyn has been using to drain your joint accounts for years. The stunned elite were no longer onlookers. They were witnesses to a collapse. Evelyn let out a choked sound of protest, but it died in her throat as Amara produced a small, silver flash drive from the folds of her dress, the ledger made digital. You invited me here to be a joke, Amara continued, her commanding presence now absolute. But you forgot that the help is the one who holds the keys to every room. I am not a punchline, Evelyn. I am the reason this house of cards is about to fall. In that moment, Amara proved she was never just a caregiver. She was the most dangerous variable in their calculated lives. She had used her invisibility as a weapon, and now, the truth was out in the blinding light. The merger, the reputation, the Roland name, it was all unraveling because they had mistaken silence for ignorance. The chaos that followed was a symphony of falling empires. Investors began to shout, phones were whipped out to cancel wire transfers, and the once orderly ballroom dissolved into a sea of peripheral panic. Victor Roland reached out a trembling hand, perhaps to beg or perhaps to bargain, but his fingers met only the cold, empty air. The man who had built a kingdom on the backs of the invisible was now truly alone, standing in the wreckage of a reputation that had vanished in a single hour. Beside him, Evelyn was a hollow shell, her face a mask of fear and disbelief as she realized that the joke had not only failed, it had consumed her. Amara Johnson did not stay to watch the debris settle. She had no need for their apologies, nor did she care for the sudden, desperate looks of awe from the guests who now tried to catch her eye. The status reversal was complete. She turned away from the center of the room, her sapphire gown trailing behind her like a royal banner, the silver embroidery catching the final glints of the dying gala. She walked toward the grand exit with a regal posture that had never been more authentic. Her back was straight, not because she was carrying the weight of a tray, but because she was finally carrying the weight of her own truth. Every step she took on the marble floor was a reclamation of the years she had spent in the shadows, a restoration of the dignity they had tried so hard to strip away. The invisible woman was gone, replaced by a queen who had dismantled a dynasty with nothing more than her silence and her memory. As she reached the heavy oak doors, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. The sound of the Roland's empire crumbling was a noise she had heard coming for years. She stepped out into the cool night air, the heavy scent of expensive perfume replaced by the clean, sharp smell of freedom. The new hierarchy had been established, one where the truth was more valuable than gold, and where a woman's worth could no longer be hidden by a uniform. Amara walked down the steps, her head held high, leaving the ruin of the elite behind her as she stepped into a world where she would never be invisible again.